everybody, Steven here, back with another review of action figures. Today I'm going to be talking about Shazam, or Captain, or as he's also known in the past as Captain Marvel. So this is my small collection that you see in front of you of a few versions of Shazam and a little bit of Black Adam and Mary Marvel. So first of all, to give you a small introduction of who Shazam really is and when was he created. Shazam was created in 1939, and the story about him goes that a young boy by the name of Billy Batson, who was also an orphan, was granted the power by the wizard Shazam because the wizard chose him to be the good representation of basic goodness in him and things of that sort, and he actually bestowed the power on him with a simple word that the boy would speak, and that word would be Shazam. Now Shazam word itself is an acronym of 6 immortal elders such as Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, and Mercury. And by speaking that word, Billy Batson would transform himself into an adult version of himself wearing a costume with the powers of superhuman strength, speed, flight, and other abilities. So the figure we see here is that of Shazam, and as he's also known by some of his enemies as the Big Cheese or the Big Red Cheese, because he has a very strong red color predominant on his costume. This particular figure comes from the DC formerly known as DC Direct and presently known as DC Collectibles, back in around mid-2000s. This was a series of figures that came in 2 waves, specifically centering around Shazam and some of the related characters. So the figure itself came out to look pretty nice. I'm very happy with the way it turned out. And of course this was not the first figure that was made of him. There is a much older figure from the Mego days that we're talking about 1970s roughly. That's where the first Captain Marvel figure came. Then soon after that, in the 1980s, as we go forward in time, Superpowers made by Kenner released also a Captain Marvel figure. And then going further in time, during the 90s, there was another figure of Captain Marvel, as he was known back then still as Captain Marvel, or as Shazam. His name later changed to Shazam. There was another figure at that time, and then more presently, starting with this figure in the 21st century and a few other ones, there was many more figures made of him as he became more and more popular. The comics about him back in the day when he was created were becoming increasingly popular, and practically, since he wasn't under DC Comics in those days, and we are talking about World War II time period, he was in a direct competition with Superman or the Superman comics. So his popularity was pretty high until later on in roughly 70s or thereabouts. The sales of his comics started to drop, and at some point when DC managed to get the rights for the character, they dropped the name Captain Marvel, which was of course then taken and absorbed by Marvel Comics. And there is an interesting discussion why his name changed and how did that come about, and how he became Shazam instead of Captain Marvel, and how Captain Marvel from Marvel Comics got that name instead, meaning Miss Marvel, who eventually became Captain Marvel. So it's a bit confusing because the characters are completely different from each other, but you could probably find that discussion on YouTube. I believe there was a video discussing that. So back to the figure here. Shazam has a very basic articulation for that time period because the DC Direct figures were never made with the intent of being fully articulated, such as Marvel Legends back in the day, So he had the basic articulation. I mean, the arms could go up and down. There was some impeding of movement for the arms due to the fact that the rubbery cape was going over his shoulders, at least on the right shoulder. And on the left, there was a bit more room because the cape was not really covering his shoulder all the way. So yes, he could put his arms up and down. There was a elbow articulation as well, none in the bicep. There was no ab crunch. He could move his legs forward about that much, and he couldn't move them backwards. There was articulation in the knee, but none in the feet. And his hands could turn 360 degrees, so left and right. And there was no waist movement either. And the final part is that he could turn his head left and right. Now the series he came in also, each figure also contained one of these, which is a plastic stand shaped like the Shazam's insignia of a yellow thunder that he also has on his chest. It's just a very simple looking stand, but it's very nicely decorated and it looks very colorful, at least, even though it's just yellow and red, but it's more of a like an eye candy the way I see it. And the color scheme on him I always found interesting, the mix of white, yellow and red. Aside from him, in that particular series of Shazam characters, there was also a figure of his twin sister, Mary Batson, who was also granted the powers by the wizard Shazam when she was reunited with her brother. So she became, by having the same powers, she became known as Miss Marvel. Sorry, not Miss Marvel, what am I talking about? She became known as Mary Marvel. And she had the same exact powers as her brother. And the costume pretty much resembled his because the color scheme was very much the same. Yellow boots, red dress, and yellow lining, and then a yellow thunder. And the cape as well was exactly the same, in the same color scheme too. And she also came with a plastic stand representing the Shazam family insignia. And just like her brother, her articulation was pretty much the same. Well, except with some small exceptions, because her hair was sculpted in such a way that it went over the shoulder, at least in one part. She wouldn't be able to move her head left or right because the hair, as you can see at the back here, and especially here at the front, would get in the way. But other than that, she could move her arms slightly forward on both sides, and she had the articulation in the elbow, so she could bend her arms. There was no articulation in the wrists, and for some unknown reason, which I'm not sure why, which I find a bit peculiar, that her left hand was molded in such a way as if it looks like a trigger hand almost, and she didn't come with any weapons because she doesn't really need any. So it was a strange way of molding this particular hand. I'm not sure what is the gesture supposed to represent. Anyway, aside from that, she also had articulation in her knees, and there is articulation in the legs, but due to the dress being over it, her articulation was actually rather more limited. So the legs could not really move much forward. She was also released in a variant option with a different color scheme, same figure, but the color of her costume was white and yellow. So that was a variation. I am not quite certain. I tried to find the reason why was there a variation in color. Maybe because some of the comics she had worn the variation of her costume. The interesting thing to note, which I found out over the internet, is that she was introduced and became part of her brother's stories way before Supergirl, who was introduced as the cousin of Superman. So she was already in comics way before Supergirl, so I found that rather interesting. So just like her brother, she's also a teenage girl, and both she and her brother, when they transform, they become adult versions of themselves. And the final member that was made in this particular line that I unfortunately still don't have is Captain Marvel Jr. Now, who is Captain Marvel Jr.? He's a good friend of, and if I remember correctly, also an orphan. He was a good friend of Billy Batson, and Shazam actually, according to the comics, at one point he saved the life of Captain Marvel Jr., or as he's is known under his alter ego, Frederick Christopher, Freddie Freeman. The boy was in trouble with one of the main enemies of Shazam back then, called Captain Nazi. So in order to save the boy's life, Shazam gave him some of his powers in order to save him. But by doing so, Freddy became also a superhero. But unlike Mary Marvel and unlike Shazam, he did not become an adult version of himself. He remained a boy, still in his teenage years, but wearing a costume that, in every sense except the color, resembled that of Shazam and Mary Marvel. His costume was predominantly blue with a yellow thunder, and also had the cape as well. So that would be rather an interesting thing. And up to the present stories, according to my research, Captain Marvel Jr. Was never represented as an adult. Even in today's comics, he was still represented as a teenage boy. So in that same line where the three of them come from, there was also Billy Batson, who came with another smaller figure called Hoppy the Rabbit, who was also wearing Shazam's costume. I'm not quite familiar with all the characters from Shazam, but I found that rabbit to be quite an interesting one, and he must be from... he must be a pet of one of the members, or... I just find it very unusual that a rabbit gets the powers of Shazam. I find that quite funny. But he was packed together with the Billy Batson figure, and unfortunately that 2-pack I also didn't manage to find, so I'm still hoping that one day I'll find those guys, including Captain Marvel Jr. And the other figure that was released in that wave was Dr. Sivana. He's supposed to be one of the early bad guys in Shazam's comics, and even now he appears in some cartoons as well these days. But he looks rather ridiculous. He's sort of a really old scientist with pointy ears and kind of protruding teeth, and he's definitely human. He's not a mutant or anything, but he just looks weird and creepy. And he has proven to be quite a thorn in the side of Shazam, because he would always challenge the big cheese, as he calls him. So that was what compromised that particular wave. So let's put Shazam here on the side and move on to the next. This particular Shazam here also came from the DC Direct time period, and he was part of a Superman Batman Public Enemies storyline by Ed McGuinness. And Shazam, of course, in that story, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it was supposed to apprehend Superman and Batman in that story, along with some other Justice League members. And this would be, I'll just show you for a second, this would be, that story was actually made into an animated movie as well, so I'll just show you what's the story I'm talking about. So there it is, Superman Batman Public Enemies. This is the DVD version. So Shazam here with many others along with Superman and Batman forms a part of that story. This particular version of Shazam also has the most modest articulation. His arms can move up and down, the head can move left to right, and instead of yellow he has more golden accents on his bracelets and the belt and the thunder on his chest, and the boots are more mustard color, and the red color of his costume is more bright. And the legs can move about that much forward. He can bend in the knee. He cannot move his legs back. He can ever so slightly bend his arm in the elbow, but the bracelets are so big in a sense and thick that they are impeding the complete bending of the elbow, so they get right in the way. This figure also came, just like most of the figures in this wave, came with a plastic stand that has Superman's logo on top of Batman's logo, or in the center of it. And other figures that came in that particular wave that are based on that story was Superman and Batman and Metallo and Captain Atom. And there were many more after that released based on Batman and Superman storylines in the design of Ed McGuinness and based on his art. So this is another pretty good representation of Shazam. This is a bit of a wear off on the cape, and he has golden lining, so yeah, it's quite an old figure already, but trying to still preserve it as much as I can. The next figure I'm gonna look at is Shazam again, but this time from the New 52 storyline, and it was released by DC Collectibles, which is the new name of the DC Direct. And in this case he's actually wearing a hood that cannot be removed. He also has a molded cape on him, and the articulation is pretty much what's to be expected as in DC Direct days, with some slight improvements. He has the bicep swivel, so he could move it to the left and right, and in the wrist there is also articulation. The legs can move about that much forward. There is the bending in the knee, no articulation in the feet or the ankles, no ab crunch, no waist movement. And the other hand, the left hand, is more shaped in an open form, while the other one is shaped as a fist. And this is just a sort of a new take or reimagining of Shazam, and his thunder is now more of a look like an actual thunder itself, meaning like a flash right across the chest with some golden lining. And the yellow was permanently replaced, it seems, with just an actual golden accent on the belt, around the insignia, and along his cape as well, and the boots. And the last version that I have of Shazam was based on Justice League War animated movie, and this is how he looked in that animated movie. Again, more or less he still wears the New 52 design costume. Of course the hood is now down, it's not over his head, and the color scheme is very much the same as the previous figure, the only difference being that the thunder itself on the chest is more yellowish, surrounded by golden lining. The articulation is rather stiff and limited. This kind of figure is pretty much from the same, more or less the same type like the figures from the Aquaman Throne of Atlantis that I covered in one of my previous videos. So they have very limited articulation, but design-wise they look rather nice, and colors as well, but they are not posable as much. Now, I will cover the last two figures I have here, and that would be the mortal enemy of Shazam, who was granted powers way before Billy Batson, centuries ago, but he became corrupt with power, and that would be Black Adam, who was also granted the power by the Wizard Shazam because he thought that Black Adam would be the right choice to have those powers, but of course the Wizard made that mistake, and slowly but surely Black Adam became corrupted, and his main idea became that he wanted to just rule the entire world. Ever since he found out about Billy Batson, aka Shazam, he wanted to overthrow him and kill him, and he's been trying to do that ever since. So this version of Black Adam is from the New 52 series. Very much the same type of costume as Shazam's, except instead of red it would be a black color and a lot of golden lining, and he also has the same insignia as well. He also has a molded hood and a very long rubbery cape that in this case looks a bit battle damaged because there is scrapes all over it. His articulation is very much the same as his counterparts, and his hand is open, his left hand is open in a grip as if to release his power of lightning through it, while the other hand is shaped as a fist. What I usually don't like about the figures like this is that they can be a little bit too stiff, so the movement can be a bit difficult. So for example, in his case the legs cannot move a whole lot forward, only about that much, because of the way the legs were sculpted, and you can bend it in the knee at least up to a point, and the arms can go up and down, but again the problem is the cape that goes over the shoulders that's kind of blocking a full movement of the arm going up. There is no articulation in the waist, no up crunch, the head is pretty stiff, and in the case of mine, I'm sure he can move left to right, but in case of mine it's very stiff, so I don't want to force it, I might crack his neck. So I'll just show you side by side the two of them based on the New 52 design. So this is how they look. Anyway, moving on to the final figure, and that would be Black Adam from the DC Collectibles Ill-Fated Icons series that ended. And these figures were made in about smaller scale, a bit under 6 inches tall. This is more of his, at least when it comes to the hairstyle, more of the classic look of Black Adam, but the lightning is more from the New 52 design. Here he also has a molded hood and a cape and the same color scheme as the other version. Now the only difference with this one is that he came with some extra hands, because DC icons are known for having exchangeable hands and lots of accessories. So in his case he would come with extra hand, that would be a fisted hand, and then also another pair of hands that has little lightning bolts molded on tip of his fingers to show or to replicate the way he releases the lightning from his hands. The articulation is very much the same. He can sort of move the legs a little bit sideways, but he cannot do a full split. He does have articulation in the upper torso, but again, in case of mine, very stiff, and for some reason he's not really moving left or to right. But the head can also move left to right somewhat, and the hands go into the socket of the arm through a small peg that you just push into the arm, and those pegs are so brittle and small that I would always advise not to force them in, because they will just easily break away. There is articulation in the knees. The boots themselves can rotate, and there is articulation in the ankle, so he's able to move the foot up and down, but there is no ankle pivot, and the legs go roughly about that much forward. So that would be Black Adam. Two versions of him. Of course, there were many more versions of him made through time, but more specifically through DC Direct, and then these two from DC Collectibles, and there is yet another version of him coming from the new upcoming DC Collectibles line. And I wanted to do this particular video due to the fact that the Shazam movie is coming in February next year, and for all of you who saw the trailer for it will know what I mean. So I'm quite excited to see it. And before I finish my video, I would just like to also emphasize the fact that Shazam had the greatest partnership with Superman, because they're very much alike, at least when it comes to powers and things of that sort. And sometimes there was a age-old question, who would win in a fight between Superman and Shazam? Well, that's a pretty good question, because in different stories and different animated representations, in some of them it seems that Superman would win, but on the other hand, because Shazam's power comes from magic, and in the newest comics going back a few years, Superman, aside from kryptonite, is also susceptible of being weak toward any magic, especially the one coming from Earth. And since the magic is responsible to an extent for Shazam's powers, that would probably mean that Shazam could easily defeat Superman. But at the same time, Billy Batson, who's transforming into Shazam, would also have a weakness of his own, because it would be simply enough to cover his mouth and he wouldn't be able to say the word, and therefore he wouldn't be able to transform. So that would be his biggest weakness right there. Then in that sense, I would rather call the fight between the two of them, in some possibilities, as an even fight, in the sense that it would be more of a stalemate, because both sides have the chance of winning. So that's all I wanted to mention about that dilemma and that debate. Anyway, I hope you guys liked my video, and please do subscribe if you like to see more of them. And I'll catch you guys next time with another action figure review. Thanks for watching. Bye.